I mentioned earlier that museums like the DIA have many objects in storage that we simply don't want anymore. They're the residue of a different kind of museum. The museum might have been, as was the case with the DIA for a short while, we were a history museum, and a science museum, and a natural history museum, and took in objects that really have no place in an art museum. To deal with this kind of thing, US museums deaccession is the word that we use, a rather ungainly word that means we get rid of something. This is a very American approach, in fact. In Europe, deaccessioning is frowned upon. The theory in Europe is that objects enter a collection at a certain time, and it's part of the history of the collection, and that individuals at the current time have no right to rewrite a history. And we take a very different point of view. Here, we regard objects that have no meaning to the collection as something of a burden. After all, as I mentioned earlier, we have to take great care of these things. We give as much care to an egg cup in a way as we do to our great Bruegel. So keeping these things around can be expensive. And the practical American solution is that we deaccession them. We sell them, and we use those proceeds to improve the collection as it is today. But when we deaccession something, we have to do so very, very carefully. We have to take into consideration what the object might mean to the community, what the object might mean to individuals who gave the work of art in the first place. And so we proceed with great caution. We sort of undo everything that we did when we took the work of art into the collection. Sometimes museums can make mistakes. And there are a number of examples in the past of this and other institutions where something went out of the door that, looking back, we think that perhaps we should not have done. Then there are those examples that very definitely have no place in the art museum today, but has tremendous emotional resonance for part of our community. And such was the case when we decided to deaccession one of the flags that Custer took into battle with him at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and that was found under the body of a trooper. The DIA bought the flag in 1895 for $54, which sounds almost funny today, but $54 back in the 1890s was worth probably something like $100,000 or so. It did so by subscription, and a trustee wrote a big check for $50. It came into the DIA, it was on view, but in 1928, when this building opened, the flag was not on view. For a couple of decades, it was on loan to the Custer Memorial National Park, and when a curator came here in 1982 and asked about it, we discovered that, in fact, for at least 10 years, it had been in storage at the National Park Service storage in Harper's Ferry. We brought the flag back here, we took great care of it, we've looked after it, but there came a point when we realized that the object being here was being unseen. Just a couple of specialists had seen, a few specialists had seen the flag over the previous decades. It had been out on loan a couple of times, but essentially it was imprisoned here. When we deaccession something, we have to sell it on the open market. We have to use those proceeds to buy more art for the collection. But to many people, this wasn't just an object that had found itself in the wrong place. This was a symbol of patriotism, of military sacrifice, and our announcement that we were going to be disposing of the flag according to our own professional standards didn't go down very well in certain quarters. And the flag sold at auction for $2.2 million. It was bought, as was expected, by a private collector, which may sound like a bad idea, but in fact, given the history of the relationship between private collectors and other museums, this in fact is a good thing, because there's a very, very high chance that within not too great a time, the collection will be put on loan at a museum or given to a museum, and the flag that the DIA had almost kept secretly for the best part of 80 years will now be released, will be on view to the public in an appropriate context. Another professional deeply concerned with the well-being of works of art in the collection is the registrar. The registrar keeps records of where the objects are. They're coming and going, their movement around the buildings. They're the individuals that enable us to know exactly where everything is. And they work very, very closely with the technicians in taking care of this aspect of the collection. Now, deaccessioning is an ongoing process at most museums. The curators work with the other staff to sort of work along as they can, when other tasks permit. But here we've actually set up a task force that over a 7-year period is going through a systematic review of all of our collections, so that at the end of 7 years, we think, we will have in our collection only those objects that we know we really want in the collection, or there is some compelling reason for keeping those objects. And taking care of the registrar's duties in this task force is our assistant registrar, Christina Gibbs.
So here at the museum, we have over 60,000 works of art in the collection. And in the registrar's office, we have a lot of duties to fulfill. We have to make sure all the objects are handled safely, and we also make sure that we document all the objects, so there's a file for every object. And this happens anytime an object comes into the building and also goes out of the building. So that includes objects that are coming in for acquisitions, for purchase consideration or gift consideration. Also, when works come in for exhibitions, they all get registered, and also loans. And then finally, we also catalog the whole deaccessioning process. So, after the curator has been in consultation with the director and they've agreed upon which objects should move forward with being considered for deaccessioning, it comes to the registrar's office. So the curator submits a form which includes the justification for why this object should be looked into for deaccessioning. And then the registrar begins a very long process, which is very detail-orientated, and we document every single step of the process. But the first step is to make sure that we actually own the object, which is called finding clear title. So we go through all of our records, including the object files. We go through any correspondence with donors. We looked into funds that were used to purchase works of art, and also go back to the old minutes from the meetings when the work actually came into the collection. So while we're doing this, we're also looking to make sure that the object does not have any restrictions to it, so that we are free and clear to dispose of the work of art. So to follow our procedures, we also collect lots of documentation and put it into the object files during this entire process. The curator also goes out and gets 2 different appraisals at least for the objects, and those go into the file. As well as, it's not required by law to write to the donors or heirs of the donors, but as a courtesy and ethically as a museum, we believe we do. So we also notify the donors or their family when an object has been up for deaccession. And all of this documentation creates a story in each object file for future generations. So after we've done all of that, we've gotten all the appraisals, all the values in, it's time to compile all the information about the object and send it off to the collections committee for final approval. And then after collections committee votes, then it goes on to the board of directors. So after the collections committee and the board of directors have both given their final seal of approval, the object is now considered deaccessioned. It is noted as such, and now it is time to move forward with the disposition of the artwork. There are a few different ways to do this, but most typically it is sold at public sale. Sometimes it will be exchanged with another museum or transferred to another museum who may have a better interest in that object. If we go with the first, we typically sell at public auction for transparency reasons. So after the method of disposition has been chosen, the object is ready to be packed and shipped. So we go out and make sure the object gets packed carefully. We take condition notes of the object, all kinds of notes before it moves, so we know the condition of the object. And then for say it's going to an auction house at public auction, we determine which auction house it will go to, and then decide to ship it there.
When we sell a work of art and use the funds to buy another work of art, we keep track of the source of the funds that we are using. So, for example, the name of a donor that appeared on the label of the work of art that was sold then is transferred to the label of the work of art that was acquired through the disposition of the original object. And you can tell that as you walk through a museum. If you look at the labels and see the words "by exchange," that indicates that this work, this one particular here, for example, was acquired using funds from works of art that were given by individuals. Some of those individuals very important to the history of this museum. This particular beautiful object here, a 17th century bust of Ottaviano Acciaiuoli by Ercole Ferrata, was acquired for this museum with the help of funds that came from the sale of works of art that were given by Edsel Ford and Hawkins Ferry, two of the DIA's greatest supporters and patrons. Just like the Ferrata sculpture, this particular ewer that we acquired in 2000 was also acquired with the help of funds raised from deaccessioning. In fact, it's quite a long list, an impressive list of over a dozen individuals who were patrons of this institution. In this case, it was very expensive. It's one of the most expensive objects that I've been associated with, and we looked at all of our funds that could possibly apply, and in the end we were able to do this because of the fact that we had an ongoing deaccessioning program that had produced funds within the Department of European Painting and Sculpture that could be used to acquire this particular sculpture. And similarly, this exquisite rock crystal crucifix over here also required the use of funds from deaccessioning. And that brings me to one final important point about this whole process, is that the individuals whose names are transferred to the label as having helped contribute towards this particular acquisition, we know are individuals who would have approved of this kind of art. This kind of art is similar, it's like the objects that the individuals gave that were sold to help us make this kind of acquisition. It's the last step in what, as I said, is a very, very careful and cautious process so that we improve the collection at the same time as we remember and take care to acknowledge the individuals who helped towards this kind